and have MP Howland up first.
Thanks, Chair. Governor, Deputy Governor, thanks for being here. Governor, the CMHC, their September numbers show that there's a downward trend in housing starts. In your January monetary policy report, you highlight in there that strong population growth is supporting inflation in rental prices. Since January, have you seen this trend continue? That it's the drastic increase in the population growth that has continued to keep rent inflation high?
I think there's more than one thing that's contributed to rent inflation. Certainly an imbalance between the demand and supply. So, and that's the numbers that CMHC is talking about. And inflation. I mean, there's no single variable that has contributed to this. But yeah.
In your report, it doesn't highlight anything else. It just says in here, a larger increase in newcomers than in the past is adding pressure to the structural supply constraint in housing. So one would take it from your own report that is the factor, correct?
Yeah, so what our report says is that there's a structural imbalance between supply and demand, and when you're adding more demand than you're adding supply, you're making that worse.
And so given that, after that January report, did you see any changes, or is it the same reason that has kept rent inflation the way it is?
I don't think there's been a big change since.
I mean, what you can see is that rent inflation has ticked down a little bit, but there's a big stock of rents, and people renew their rents at different times. So it takes a while for new rents to feed into the average rent. What's in the CPI is the average rent increase. So we are starting to see some evidence, and I want to be clear, it's not, we don't have as good data on this. But the new rents, so I'm getting to your question.
Just respectfully, the rent inflation has not changed to below 8% for the whole year, which is an indication that nothing has really changed. What I take your monetary report as was a warning in January when you wrote what you wrote. At the same time, 2 years ago, the government's own department had warned them that they were going to increase the population so drastically that there was a housing crisis and it would get even worse. That was the government's own department. Given the numbers that we have of rent inflation being over 8%, my question is, if the government had heeded your warning and its own department's warning, would we not have seen as drastic of a rent inflation as we did over the past few years, but especially this year since it stayed above 8 the whole year?
Look, I think it's fair to say that the imbalance between demand and supply was further exaggerated by the large population increase that added a lot to demand, and yes, that put upward pressure on rents.
Of course, and so my question is, if they had heeded the warnings from the bank and their own department this year, do you think that it would have had less pressure on rent inflation?
If there had been less population growth, there would have been less pressure on rent inflation.
And the reason why I'm saying that is because there was a really damning report yesterday from Food Banks Canada that now there's more than 2 million Canadians going into a food bank in a single month. This is something that when we talk about doorsteps, we see the pain, we hear the pain from Canadians all over. Whereas 40% of someone's paycheck used to be on housing costs, now it's up to 60 and sometimes 80%. There's less money for Canadians. And now we're seeing more food bank usage. And when you look at the population growth, the rapid increase that the government had implied, my question is that with food bank usage going up so much right now, like what is your message to those people? Because, it seemed like my colleagues from the Liberal side had painted such a rosy picture, but 2 million plus Canadians are going to a food bank in a single month.
There's no question that, particularly for people at the lower end of the income distribution, it's been a very tough couple of years. High inflation was particularly concentrated in food, it's in rent. These are necessities. You can't cut back on necessities. They're necessities. The best thing we can do is to get inflation down so that they can have more confidence that their cost of living is not going to keep rising the way it was 2 years ago.
Right.
We've done that. That's good news.
But just to that point, so those people that you're talking about that are lower income, would you not agree that in giving them or raising taxes on them only hurts them further, such as like a carbon tax, or if government spending means that they're going to increase taxes on Canadians? Does that not hurt them further?
Look, I really don't want to get into commenting on specific tax measures. I think I've been pretty clear. I completely agree with you that lower income people have been hit hardest by high inflation. And that is one of the reasons why low inflation is such an important policy.
I just...
MP Allen, that's the time. Now we're off to MP Chambers now for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Governor, Senior Deputies. Well, it's very nice to have you back. I just want to talk about prominent payment systems just for a moment. I'm going to try to link this to the productivity discussion. My understanding is that Interact's e-transfer service is considered a prominent payment system under the Bank of Canada. That's correct, right? It's been designated. But I also understand that Interact is in non-compliance with the standards that the bank sets out with respect to at least two of the standards. Primarily one, that the criteria for joining Interact is public. And two, that their pricing mechanism should be risk-based, not volume-based. Now, the problem I have here is that, one, there's no transparency. The bank has requested through the standards that there is transparency. And two, the fee schedule is secret, but we know that it's volume-based based on testimony yesterday at industry committee. So my question is there any enforcement actions against Interact to bring them in compliance?
So I think I think we're talking about two different things. So there is a set of global standards for payment systems that articulate the kinds of things you're talking about. Our enforcement powers relate to Retail Payments Act. So when you talk about an enforcement action.
Well, you regulate e-transfers, correct? Or they are considered a prominent payment system for e-transfers, right?
Yes.
And the Bank of Canada has listed that the standards it expects those entities, the prominent payment systems, to comply with. Interact is not in compliance. They've admitted it. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, is the bank pressuring them to do the things that you've asked them to do?
Yes, we are working with them.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, you used the word enforcement measure, so yes. Are we working with Interact on those standards? Yes.
I guess I would say you have political cover to push them much further because it's 10 years since the bank has admitted that modernization to retail payments has a significant economic upside. And if we're worried about productivity, I would think that you could lean on this organization and Payments Canada, which, by the way, gave a sole source contract to an entity that's completely ripe with conflicts of interest, which is owned by the banks, right? They have an incentive to not modernize to protect that profit pool, but they're in non-compliance. So I'm very glad to hear that you're working with them.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is we are working closely with Payments Canada. I mean, having a fast payment system in Canada is an important step for productivity. It's an important step for our economy. It's an objective that we support.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll switch back. My understanding is it clear from or would it be safe to say from your testimony that the fight against inflation is not over, that there is risk that it could reaccelerate? Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say we've reached a very important milestone. We've got inflation low again.
But is the fight over? Is the fight over?
No.
Okay. So there's provincial elections all across the country. There's a federal election coming up at least within the next year. You've got provinces promising to send people checks. You have the PBO saying that the government's blowing through its deficit target. Sounds to me like a lot of fiscal stimulus. What recommendations would you have for governments who are considering a lot of fiscal stimulus when the fight against inflation is not over? Do
Well-
you support additional fiscal stimulus?
So, normally we don't comment at all on fiscal policy. When inflation was high and we were working very hard to get inflation down, we did express concern that if there was a lot more spending, and in particular if fiscal spending was well above potential growth, that could make it more difficult to get inflation back down. We've now got inflation back down. So I'm really not feeling the need to comment on fiscal policy.
So
really, fiscal policy is your job. Monetary policy is
Fair
our
enough.
job.
Would you say to tread carefully? Would that be a fair recommendation that you would provide politicians who can't help themselves but spend, including provincial governments? I'm an equal offender here.
Tread carefully, but look, I'm not here to give you fiscal policy advice. We are here to talk about monetary policy.
Thank you, Governor.
Chambers and Kelly, I'll start off the top.
Thank you, and thank you, Governor, for clarifying for everyone that if the carbon tax is removed from things like fuel, the price of these items will in fact go down. So that was, I think, helpful to have on the record. And would that go for everything, all other sort of products that are tied to this? So if a truck that transports food no longer has the tax applied to it, then we are easing the input cost on food, for example.
I don't have an estimate of the secondary effects, but the direct effects on overall inflation are relatively modest. The secondary effects are going to be even more modest. So, I'm not saying there aren't some products where that could be important, but if you look, what we're looking at is CPI inflation, everything in the basket. And when you look at it that way, the secondary effects are going to be de minimis.
Back to at the very end of your response to Mr. Morantz's last question, you were beginning to talk about timelines for project approvals and the impact that has on productivity, the drag on productivity. So I'd like you to maybe complete your answer, if you'd like to, and talk about how regulatory timelines create delay, which creates a drag on productivity, which is where we get this declining per capita GDP that we have in Canada.
So, look, we have well-intentioned regulations at different levels, federal, provincial, municipal in this country. These are well-intentioned regulations. They want to make sure that these investments are in the best interests. The difficulty is at times we have overlapping, sometimes even conflicting regulatory approval processes. They're tough for investors, people who want to build, to navigate, and there can be considerable uncertainty in how long it's going to take. So,
If I may.
So what that does, it scares investors off.
Indeed. So delays on that capital will go somewhere else. For example, United States. Yeah, and the gap in investment, the investment deficit with the United States, the difference between American investment in Canada and Canadian investment in the United States is now. Do you have a
I don't have the
statistic
number
on
in
that?
front of me, but
Okay.
there's no question that too many companies, so foreign capital, even some Canadian capital, is going to the United States because they can get faster regulatory approvals.
Right, and we've heard at this committee that difference is almost $500 billion. That sound about right and roughly.
Yeah, I don't have a
correct?
number, but it's a big number.
Okay, so can you tell us about? Would you care to name some of the specific regulatory obstacles to investment?
No, I'm not going to get into sort of specific line by line issues. I think that the message is we need to look at this from a whole of country point of view, and these are well intentioned. But I think where we can streamline the process, provide more certainty, that's going to encourage investment. The productivity problem, it's a long-standing problem. It's going to take, this is something along with getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. These are some things that we know what the problem. We know there's a problem. We know what it is. It's going to take some concerted effort to cut through it. But it's something we could do that, if we can do it, could have pretty good return in the short run.
So is it wise then to increase capital gains taxes when you are in an acknowledged productivity crisis and an investment crisis where investment is going to other peer countries and not into Canada? Is that a wise time to raise a tax on investment?
I think I've said everything I'm going to say on that question.
Okay, I'll take that as no, that it is not a good time to raise a tax. But I don't know if I have any time left for another question.
10 seconds.
Any C69, is that a good one as far as barriers to investment then?
I'm not going to comment on specific legislation.
Thank you, MP Kelly.